Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra, verse 61, Yukti number 33 in my numbering. This is quite a beautiful and significant verse in the text, one which has become rather famous, and rightly so. So we can sing it together. Ubhayor bhavayor jnane dhyatva madhyam samashrayet yugapacha dvayam tyaktva madhye tattvam prakashate. Meditating on the cognition of any two entities or any two states of mind or emotion, take refuge in the center between them. Releasing both simultaneously, reality shines forth in the center. So in the simplest version of this particular yukti, the simplest version is really just pay attention to the space between the thoughts. And this is the version of the yukti that's become very famous. And many people have heard it without even knowing that it comes from the VBT. Let's remember that that the earliest version of the VBT first entered circulation in English back in 1957. So it's little pieces of it have sort of become part of our spiritual culture for 60 years now. But again, of course, the reason we're doing this whole series is almost nobody has studied the text in depth in this way. But I want to say that pay attention to the space between the thoughts is a perfectly good instruction. It's a great beginner instruction, although I would say it becomes a better instruction for beginners if we're talking about pay attention to the space between trains of thought. Because for most people, one thought follows another in sort of immediately in a given train of thought. And then a train of thought sort of exhausts itself. If you're not sort of actively giving it energy, it exhausts itself after, a few minutes at most. And then there's a space before the next train of thought begins. And that's a space that everyone can notice, everyone can experience, right? Even if, like most people, you tend to get one thought after another, still, after a couple of minutes, there's going to be a space. It's just that most of us sort of steam right through those spaces without really noticing them, right? So the verse, however, has more depth to it than that simple instruction. And again, that instruction is great. But the verse uses the word bhava in Sanskrit, which means it's a very usefully flexible word because it means any existent thing, any entity, any being, and any mental emotional state. So the verse is actually talking about the cognition of any two things, whether those things are internal, like mental emotional states, or indeed anything else, that there's these gaps between our cognitions. It reminds me of a story that a meditation teacher told me a long time ago. Great teacher named Swami Anantananda, and he told the story of one time he was walking along next to a big fence, a wooden fence that had only tiny gaps between the boards. And he was curious, what's behind this high fence? And he peeked through one of the gaps and he saw what seemed to be a beautiful garden, but he could only see this little sliver of it. And he wanted to see more. This is a true story, but it's also a metaphor for the spiritual life. He wanted to see more of that beautiful garden. And then it struck him, what if I walk rapidly along and just focus on the gaps. And indeed, when he did that, he could see the garden, sort of by the same principle that movie film works, right? There's a bunch of still frames, but then it creates the whole image. So he realized this was a revelation, this was a gift of grace. Paying attention to the gaps reveals a whole different world, and it's true. We're just highly conditioned to pay attention to our thoughts. And our society, our culture, and certainly our economy gives no value to the gaps because they have no value economically, culturally. So we don't get any cueing or conditioning to pay attention to those gaps. And yet in those gaps lies freedom, lies simple presence, lies pure being. And of course, pure being is actually everywhere all the time, including in your thoughts. But this tradition articulates very clearly, and I think correctly, that you can't realize pure being in everything and all your thoughts until you first realize it in the gaps, that there is a krama, there's a sequence of realization that is not optional. That by acquainting yourself with the nature of pure being, when it shines forth, right, what the verse calls reality, shines forth in the center between those two cognitions, you will later be able to see how that same reality, that same being, awareness, presence, shines forth in everything. But just because everything is consciousness, just because everything is God, doesn't mean everything is equally effective in the realization of the nature of consciousness. Right? Just because everything's God doesn't mean everything is conducive to the realization that everything's God. That's a very key point. So we give some attention, we give some love, some awareness to these gaps. And it's very simple, but it does take a lot of practice because, again, you're conditioned in pretty much the opposite way. Right? So meditating, dhyatva, on the cognition, jnane, of any two states or entities, ubayor bhavayor, or not any two thoughts, but also any two emotions or moods, right? The gap is not just the gap between thoughts. It's the moment when consciousness or awareness naturally touches down in its essence before it manifests another type of experience. So notice that the verse says, take refuge, samashrayet, beautiful term, very typical of Sanskrit literature. Originally the idea of being in the hot Indian sun and you go under the shade of a tree, that's taking refuge. And then that term became metaphorically used in terms of spiritual teachings, taking refuge in the teachings. And here, though, it's taking refuge in the center, the madhya, a word used both for the central channel of the energy body and also the center in terms of the core, and also the between. Another flexible word. One should take refuge, or one may take refuge in the center. Madhyam samashrayet. Releasing both simultaneously, releasing the pair, meaning the cognition that is just completed and the cognition that sort of wants to arise, but you're just letting it go for just that moment, Again, it could be the space between cognitions of external phenomena or internal phenomena. Doesn't matter. Releasing both simultaneously, just letting go of your compulsive focus on these cognitions, these moods, these emotions, dropping into the center. For some, easier said than done. Still, orient yourself in this way, releasing both simultaneously reality, tattva, in the sense of just reality here. Reality shines forth, prakashate. Reality manifests itself, madhye, in the center. So it's simple. It's just about orienting yourself in this way. Where are the madhyas in your life? Where can you find this madhya? There's countless opportunities all day long. It's just about getting oriented to this possibility. Okay, so just try it for a minute. Don't try to control anything. Don't try to stop thoughts. Don't try to push away emotions. Just let whatever happens happen, and just notice the little gaps. Om. So this is one of those practices that you don't need any special posture for. You don't need any special yogic knowledge. And you don't need to try to control anything. You don't need to try to make the gaps bigger. You just notice them and you sort of enter into them. See what happens. Maybe they get a little bit bigger on their own as you bring attention to these gaps. And you can do this as an all day long practice, just setting the intention to notice these gap moments and just dropping in to simple presence, just the simple awareness of being itself. That's all there is to it. In the comments thread, Jerry mentions even the possibility of the gaps between repetitions of a mantra. And that's true. In fact, a method of japa in the tradition that's been pretty much forgotten today is repeating your mantra only on the exhale.